raised in Maryland, Pennsylvania border, just southeast of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in what was considered to be a pro-Confederate area of the state. I told him I'd tell everybody he's from South Pennsylvania. His interest in the Civil War started as a child and as a result of many visits to the Gettysburg battlefield. He studied the war from a military point of view his entire life, and since his retirement from Caterpillar has relocated to Corinth and has become a partner in a tour business called the Shiloh Civil War Tours. The other half of his company is David Stewart from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, who now lives in Tupelo. Tom does individual and group tours, takes groups on yearly trips to Gettysburg, Richmond, Chattanooga, and Vicksburg. Tom and his partner both believed that the war in the West was crucial to the South in winning the war, with the railroad crossing at Corinth being the linchpin of the Western theater. He has studied different types of artillery and how it affected the outcome of the battles, and we've been talking to us tonight about these various aspects of artillery. He also has his cards with him up front in case anybody wants to hire as a tour guide or one of these other trips. And Tom believes in a round table discussion, and anytime we have a question or comment, feel free to jump in. That's the kind of fellow he is. Very soft-spoken, but very knowledgeable fellow. Tom Rambeau.
Thank you, Mark. Well, like Mark said, I do battlefield tours at Corinth and Shiloh. And before that, I moved here with my wife, who's transferred from Caterpillar down to Corinth, Mississippi. And I could truly say that we really love it here and hope that we stay here a lot longer. In addition to Gettysburg, I was fortunate enough to be within 2 hours of Sharpsburg, Manassas, Winchester, Newmarket, Harper's Ferry, Fredericksburg, Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania, the 7 days, Chancellorsville, Richmond, and all of Jackson's Valley campaign. So I had plenty to do when I lived there, and now I find myself in the heart of the Western theater of the war. Tonight I'd like to speak to you a little bit about artillery, how it works, and how it affected the battles of Shiloh, Corinth, Davis's Bridge, and Bryce's Crossroads. Artillery has been referred to as many different things by many different people. Here are some quotes from past military leaders. Artillery is the god of war. The battlefield consists of two types of people, artillerymen and targets. Artillery adds dignity to what would otherwise be an ugly brawl. Artillery, the final argument of kings. Cannon, an instrument used for the rectification of national boundaries. Artillery conquers, infantry occupies. A battery of artillery is worth 1,000 muskets. There are many, many more of these quotes. I'm sure you get the idea that how artillery has changed the outcome of many battles during history. The first known use of artillery was in AD 1132 by the Chinese, and that is only logical because they invented gunpowder. The rifled cannon were developed in the 1840s and 1850s. Before that, cannon pretty much stayed the same with no major changes until the exploding shell was developed in the early 1700s. The use of the rifled guns made a dramatic change on the battlefield, just as rifled muskets did. The range and accuracy increased, but the same Napoleonic tactics remained in place, resulting in horrific casualties to infantry and cavalry. Rifled cannon required a new type of projectile, which was perfected by Charles James, after which the James rifle was named. James was a pioneer in the textile industry and promoted the use of steam power in southern cotton mills. In the 1850s, his new rifled projectile was adapted to the new rifle guns being developed. Many smoothbore 3-inch guns were sent back to the armories and rebored to 3.67-inch rifled guns known as 12-pound James rifles. Rifled guns were also being produced with 3.8-inch bore known as 14-pound James rifles. These James rifles were made from bronze, and the bronze created both a positive and negative result. The positive being that bronze was a softer metal which expanded when it became hot from excessive firing and tended not to explode like iron guns did. The negative result was that bronze rifling tended to wear out quickly, affecting the accuracy of the gun. Because of the wear factor, James bronze rifles were phased out as the war went on. Unfortunately, Charles James was phased out in 1862 when a new shell he was working on exploded prematurely. At the same time, Robert Parrott developed a Parrott rifle, which was made from a cast iron barrel but had a wrought iron ring which was heated and placed over the breech and allowed to cool. This strengthened the breech in an attempt to strengthen it and keep the gun from exploding after heavy firing. What you have to remember is that most artillery pieces just sat. Now sometimes they would use them for target practice, but other than that, a cannon usually sat. And then on the day of a battle, could be fired as many as 300 to 400 times. The iron guns would get hot, the breech would explode and injure and kill many of the artillerymen. The bronze guns, of course made from a softer metal, would expand and tend not to explode. That was the advantage of the bronze gun. Now, at the same time, a fellow named, John Griffin developed what was commonly known as the 3-inch ordnance rifle, which is sometimes called the 10-pound ordnance rifle. This rifle became the most popular gun of the war and could fire 2 rounds per minute and could hit the end of a flour barrel at 1 mile. There were 3 basic types of guns used in the Civil War: rifled, which I just mentioned, smoothbore field guns, and howitzers. Field guns fired the projectile at a flatter trajectory at a higher velocity for a longer distance and used a larger powder charge. Howitzers fired mostly exploding rounds from a shorter barrel at a higher trajectory. All 3 types of guns could fire grape and canister. Eventually, the most popular gun of the war would become the 1857 Napoleon smoothbore bronze 12-pound gun. The Napoleon was developed in Europe in 1853 and brought to the United States in 1857. It was commonly just called a Napoleon. It could perform the same functions as the field gun and the howitzer and weighed less than both of those guns. This also allowed for the same shells to be used in the battery as opposed to early in the war when batteries consisted of a mix of 6-pound field guns and 12-pound howitzers. Okay, ammunition. Civil War artillery, 4 basic types of projectiles were employed by Civil War field artillery: solid shot, shells, case shot, and canister. Solid shot were round, spherical projectiles of solid iron or smoothbores and commonly called cannonballs or shot. When elongated for rifled weapons, the projectile became known as a bolt. Solid projectiles were used against opposing batteries, wagons, and buildings, as well as enemy personnel. While shot could ricochet across the ground against advancing infantry and cavalry, bolts tended to bury themselves upon impact in the ground and therefore were not used a great deal by field artillery. Shells were basically a spherical or conical hollow iron projectile filled with a black powder bursting charge. It was designed to break into several ragged fragments. Spherical shells were exploded by fuses set to open an opening in the shell, which ignited the shell near the intended target. The time of detonation was determined by adjusting the length of the fuse. Rifle shells were detonated by similar fuses or by percussion fuse detonating the shell upon impact. Case shot had a thinner wall than the shell and was filled with a number of small lead or iron balls. A timed fuse ignited and burst the charge inside the shell, which fragmented the casing and scattered the contents in the air. Case shot was intended to burst about 50 to 75 yards short of the target, the fragments being carried downfield by the velocity of the shot. Canister consisted of tin cylinders in which were packed a number of iron or lead balls. Upon discharge, the cylinder split open and the smaller projectiles fanned out like a shotgun. Okay, at the start of the war, the Union had about 228 field guns, and by the end of the war, over 1,700 pieces, half of which were 1857 Napoleons. There are no exact records of Confederate field guns, but most were captured at the start of the war from U.S. armories such as Harper's Ferry and all the guns along the Texas frontier where the Army was fighting the Comanches. Also, many larger guns were captured from all the ports along the South Atlantic and Gulf Coast. John B. Floyd, who was the former governor of Virginia and Secretary of War when the war started, was accused of sending large quantities of guns, rifled muskets, and other war materials to Southern arsenals prior to the war in anticipation of them being captured when the war started. This is the same John Floyd that was promoted to Major General by Jefferson Davis and sent by Albert Sidney Johnston to command Fort Donelson. He then promptly surrendered it without much of a fight while he snuck out in the middle of the night by boat. The Union almost always had the advantage in number and quantity of guns, the quality of guns, especially at the beginning of the war. They had more ironworks that were capable of producing more in the way of cannon and rifles and other materials of war. The Confederates did produce large quantities of cannon at places like the Traeger Ironworks in Richmond and other ironworks located in Nashville, Memphis, Rome, Georgia, Atlanta, and New Orleans. As the war went on and these cities fell into Union hands, their capacity to produce fell, with only Richmond remaining at the end. Now, in the Battle of Shiloh, there were more guns collected at Shiloh than any other time on any other battlefield prior to that. 70% of the Confederates and 50% of the Federals had never been in battle before. Most of the officers were political appointees and had never before handled large numbers of troops and guns. Besides the heavy rain that fell that April, the slow march to Shiloh was mostly due to inexperience. The Confederates had 109 guns and 23 batteries, and the Union had 126 guns and 27 batteries. Although almost equal in numbers, the Union had a big advantage in newer rifled cannon. They had 64 of the rifled guns there. The Confederates had only 7 of the ordnance rifles at Shiloh. At Shiloh, the Federals were in defensive positions, with the Confederates being the attacking force, except for the second day at Shiloh, where they used their guns to great advantage, even though they were outnumbered 2-to-1 in guns and men. Being in a fixed position allows the gunners to have their fields of fire and distances marked ahead of time, and always gives them the advantage. The attacking force not only has to find suitable positions to place their guns, but then has to find the range before they can be effective. The first morning at the Battle of Shiloh found the Confederates attacking both Sherman's Shiloh Church position and Prentice's camps further to the east. These two separate parts of the battle had two completely different outcomes, mainly due to how the artillery was deployed. Not only did Sherman have fixed positions and preset fields of fire, but he also had mostly newer, superior 14-pound James rifles. His guns were able to sweep the fields and ravines in front of that position with devastating results, as seen in Ray Field, where the 6th Mississippi lost 300 of 425 men who bravely made 3 attacks there. William Bates' 2nd Tennessee Regiment was also nearly wiped out by the intense artillery fire in front of Shiloh Church. After Patrick Claiborne's attacks were repelled, the brigades of Bushrod Johnson, Patton Anderson, and Robert Russell were also thrown back with heavy losses. Not until the Confederates brought up 4 batteries of artillery and troops who had captured Prentice's camps were they able to finally push the Union troops off the Shiloh Church line. Meanwhile, while this was going on, in front of Prentice's camps, the fight had a completely different outcome. In addition to the brigades of Wood, Shaver, Gladden, and Chalmers, the Confederates were able to bring forward 5 batteries of artillery, or a total of 28 guns, against which the Union only had 2 batteries of 6 guns each. Prentice's troops were quickly routed and the camps taken. Unfortunately, Adlai Gladden was mortally wounded in this attack when a shell fragment severed his arm at the shoulder. His experience and leadership would be sorely missed as the battle unfolded. After the Shiloh Church line was taken, the Union retreated to what was commonly known as the Crossroads and set up a second line of defense under Sherman and McClernand. The Confederates attacked this line with 20,000 men and 30 guns and routed the Union forces there with heavy casualties on both sides. During this attack, 17 Union guns were captured and most of the artillery horses were killed. So many horses were killed as the day went on that most guns that were captured were unable to be moved. As this was happening on the Confederate left, the remnants of Prentice's division and parts of 2 other Union divisions were fortifying a strong position in the center of the battlefield known as the Hornet's Nest. Here, along a sunken road in dense blackjack oak thicket, 16 regiments of infantry were posted along with 20 cannon, many of which were 10 and 20-pound Parrott rifles and were manned by experienced artillerymen. During the course of the afternoon, the Confederates made at least 8 separate infantry charges, recklessly ordered by Braxton Bragg, with devastating results. It wasn't until Daniel Ruggles assembled 53 guns about 4:30 and pulverized the Hornet's Nest that position could be captured with the loss of 2,250 Union prisoners. While this was going on, the Confederates on the right were attacking the division of Stephen Hurlbut in the cotton field and the peach orchard, and the brigades of John MacArthur and David Stewart in the steep ravines near the river. These attacks were supported by 5 full batteries and were successful in driving the Union troops back to the landing. Unfortunately, Albert Sidney Johnston was killed here, gallantly leading his troops forward. To this day, it is not known why he was at the head of his troops, instead of remaining in the rear in a safe place. Most think he felt that his inexperienced troops, especially the officers, needed his leadership and inspiration. Who knows what the outcome of the battle would have been if he had been killed at this time. In that same vein, when Grant reached the battlefield that first morning, he immediately rode over the battlefield to confer with his generals. While doing this, he was hit in his sword scabbard by a shell fragment, bending it in half, which could have easily killed him. I don't know if many people know that, but that's an actual fact, that Grant could have easily been killed that day, just as Sherman could have been easily killed at Shiloh Church when he put his hand up and tried to fend off a volley of infantry fire. He was wounded in the finger. Finally, at the end of the day, with the Union Army pushed back to the landing, Grant was able to assemble 50 guns, including 5 large siege guns, which anchored his line, along with what remained of his exhausted and demoralized troops, about 20,000 men. In addition to these guns, there were 2 gunboats on the Tennessee River firing 32-pound and 8-inch shells at the Confederates during their final attack of the day across Dill Branch and up towards the landing. Without this artillery, Grant would never have survived the day. General Nelson of Buell's army did arrive at the end of the day, but only had 1 regiment in line for Chalmers and Jackson's final attack. Nelson had no artillery on line that first day. On the second day, Buell had about 13,500 troops and only 3 batteries of artillery on the Union left. Lew Wallace also showed up for the second day with his entire division, which included 6 gun batteries. With his army thus reinforced, Grant outnumbered the Confederates 2-1 in men and artillery the second day. Beauregard's men fought valiantly and used their artillery effectively to hold back the attacks, but were eventually forced to call off the fighting and retreat back to Corinth. Are there any questions so far about any of this?
What does the 10-pound, 12-pound, 14-pound, that refer to the missile?
Yes, that designated like a 3-pounder or a 6-pounder was the weight of the iron shot that it fired. And other guns were designated, like the ordnance rifle was designated 3-inch ordnance rifle. But that actually shot a 10-pound iron ball for a solid shot. But most of the guns were designated by the weight of the iron shot that they fired. Now, Parrott guns were made from 10 and 20-pound field pieces, 30-pound Parrott rifles, which there's one in Corinth today as we speak. There's one there at the railroad crossing. And Parrott guns went all the way up to 300 pounds. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Swamp Angel. The Swamp Angel was a 300-pound Parrott rifle that was built to bombard the city of Charleston, South Carolina. And they fired it 35 times, and on the 36th shot, it exploded, killing most of the gun crew. Now, that was the biggest gun made in the Civil War, was a 300-pound Parrott rifle. So, the gun that's sitting there in Corinth today is a beautiful weapon. If you ever get a chance when you're up in Corinth the next time, take a look at that gun. It's only been there for a couple months.
I want to ask you, I've never understood the solid shot that had the powder in the middle. They light the fuse, they would cut the fuse off for the distance, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, but here's my problem with understanding. When did they light the fuse and hurry up, throw it down in the cannon? I mean, how did the
No,
fuse?
it wasn't a paper fuse that you think of in the old movies where they throw the iron bomb. It was actually, the fuse was cut into the shell, and it could be cut into the shell. Let's say they could cut it for 200 yards, 400 yards, 600 yards, or 800 yards. When the gun fired, the powder charge that fired the projectile lit the fuse. That's how the fuse was lit. And then, of course, it prescribed the amount of distance before it exploded.
And it would be like scrap, though, was it busted?
Shrapnel, yes, yeah. And that was the idea of the exploding shell, was designed to create shrapnel. And then, of course, case shot had not only powder inside, but smaller balls. And when it exploded above the troops, it created more shrapnel. And so it created a lot of casualties among infantry and artillery, especially artillery forces.
Was the Gatling gun used in the Gatling gun?
Gatling gun. The Gatling gun was tested, and actually it was around during the Civil War, but it wasn't really used much. For some reason that nobody wanted it. I don't know if it was because nobody really knows why. Now, after the war, of course, you saw in the movies where they use it against the Indians and all that. But
How about Josie Wales?
yeah, they never really used it much in the Civil War.
Outlaw Josie Wales.
Yeah.
64 when it came in, wasn't it?
Yeah. For some reason, I know Lincoln didn't want it. It was demonstrated for him, and it worked, but he didn't want it. I think it jammed a lot.
It was a waste of bullets.
Yeah.
They didn't feel that many bullets going out would be, would kill as many. They thought that one bullet at a time was the best way to
Yeah.
get rid of them.
They weren't really aimed shots, so that's I guess that's why they didn't use it. I think it did jam the early ones.
Tom, I read too that not only did these cannons inflict injury, but it just demoralized troops, especially at night. They say that Shiloh over there, that second night, that they couldn't sleep, that the gunboats just constantly bombing.
Yeah, they fired every 15 minutes. They would fire a volley. They did demoralize. they really didn't do much in the way of damage. So, but, like I said, Grant's last line was anchored by 50 guns, including the big 24-pound siege guns. When you go to Shiloh today, you can see those guns right across the street from the visitor center. He had 5 there during the battle. There are 2 there now. And you can't miss them when you come in there. And let's see, also, I was going to say something else about that. Yeah, you know, Beauregard has been, of course, became a villain because people thought he could have taken that last line. If they hadn't wasted so much time taking the Hornet's Nest, that may have been true. And also on the Union right, which was Johnston intended when the battle started to go around the Union right and get between Grant and the land area. If he could have done that at any point earlier in the day, it probably would have been successful. But they were so obsessed with the Shiloh church line and the Hornet's Nest that nothing happened until 6 or 6:30 in the evening. By the time they were ready to attack Grant's last line, he had already established his line of defense. And I just don't think that could have worked. Confederates were not demoralized, but they were exhausted. A lot of them were out of ammunition. A lot of their artillery was out of ammunition. And I just don't think that last attack could have worked. But nobody really knows that. So. Okay, the first day of the Battle of Corinth, Union troops occupied what was called the Old Beauregard Line, which had been built by the Confederates to defend against the siege 6 months earlier. This line was 3 miles outside of town and was defended by infantry and artillery. Many of the guns there, again, were new rifled guns and were now equipped with the new Hotchkiss percussion shell. Did you say you just found one of them? Okay, so these shells were relatively new at that time of the war. And although the Union defenses were strong, the Confederate attack was overwhelming, and they pushed the Union troops back all along the Beauregard line to their next line of fortified positions. The Union commander, William Rosencrantz's strategy of making the enemy deploy and fight for each position was working as the Confederates moved forward, taking heavy casualties. One of these marked positions, or prepared positions, Battery F, was manned with troops and artillery and resulted in many Confederate casualties. Here again, the prepared positions had their fields of fire and distances already zeroed in. Because of the hilly and rough landscape, the Confederates were only able to deploy and effectively use a small number of guns. The Union position at the White House had 11 field pieces, and because they were only 750 yards from Battery Robinette and Williams, the big 10 and 20-pound Parrott rifles in those forts were able to support the Union troops fighting there. Again, however, the Confederates, with superior numbers, were able to push the enemy back to the inner line of forts, where the battle ended for the day. Earl Van Dorn, the commanding Confederate general, who had kept no reserves at all, and had no idea that Rosecrans had kept an entire division in reserve at Corinth. Van Dorn also had no idea that the inner ring of forts existed. He thought, like Beauregard at Shiloh, that all he had to do the next day was to mop up the rest of the Union Army. The Union artillery at Corinth was impressive, to say the least. 113 total guns, 74 of which were field guns, and 39 were emplaced larger guns in the 7 forts. Those guns included 8 30-pound Parrott rifles, like the one that now sits at the rail crossing in Corinth, 7 20-pound Parrott rifles, 3 8-inch siege guns, and 8 24-pound siege guns, like the ones across the street from the Shiloh Visitor Center. On the second day of the battle, Van Dorn's plan was a 4 a.m. artillery barrage, followed by a dawn all-out attack on the Union defenses. When his 4 a.m. barrage started, the Union counter-battery fire was so devastating that most of the horses were killed or disabled, and the cannoneers ran away. The 14-pound James rifle that now sits in the Corinth Visitor Center was first captured by Confederates at Shiloh, and then recaptured by the Union during this artillery exchange. What followed was one of the bloodiest frontal attacks for its size in the entire war. Even with superior artillery support in fixed positions, the Confederates attack broke through into the town and captured and briefly held batteries Robinette and Powell. Rosecrans, however, was able to counterattack with his reserves and drive the enemy back and win the battle. The worst of the fighting took place at Battery Robinette, where John Moore's brigade made 3 charges, led by William Rogers in the 2nd Texas. Rogers and his men actually got inside the fort and fought hand-to-hand with the Union troops manning the big guns. The Union reserves, plus the 30-pound Parrotts at Battery Williams, were able to kill Rogers and most of his men. Rogers was found dead at the fort with several holes in the body armor that he was wearing. He is buried right where he fell by order of General Rosecrans, who referred to Rogers as the bravest man he had ever seen. Confederate casualties numbering 4,233 present represent 20% of the 22,000 men in Van Dorn's army, one of the highest percentage rates of any battle in the Civil War. The Union losses were 2,520 of the 2,300 engaged, or about 10%. The high percentage of Confederate losses was a direct result of Union superiority in number and size of guns. Anybody have any questions about Corinth, Battle of Corinth? Okay, the following day, the retreating Confederates reached their wagon train at Davis Bridge, just as Union troops coming from Bolivar under Edward Ord reached the same bridge. In the first phase of the fight, John Moore's Confederate brigade held the west side of the bridge against a superior Union force, which included 2 batteries of artillery. Moore's brigade was almost wiped out as they retreated back across the bridge, losing all 4 of their guns. Moore's brigade, which started the 3-day battle with over 2,000 men, was now down to less than 300. In the afternoon, the Confederates were able to bring up 16 guns and more troops, holding the bridge long enough for the rest of the army to escape down the Boneyard Road. Okay, last battle. Artillery played a major role in the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads, fought later in the war. As the battle progressed with the Union holding a large numeric advantage, Nathan Bedford Forrest boldly ordered his 21-year-old artillery captain, John Morton, to advance his ordnance rifles to within 200 yards of the Union lines and open on them with double canister. This was an extremely dangerous move, and along with his famous double envelopment of both flanks, drove the enemy back the Wire Road, ending the battle in a complete rout of Samuel Sturgis's army. Although being outnumbered 8,500 to 3,500 roughly, Forrest was able to defeat the larger force, inflicting over 2,600 casualties, including 1,500 captured and taking 16 guns. Bryce's Crossroads remains one of the great tactical victories of all time and continues to be studied by military organizations around the world. Now, personally, I think Forrest and Stonewall Jackson were the 2 greatest battlefield tacticians in the war. And Patrick Clayton was maybe a close third, but he doesn't get the hoopla that the other 2 do. I hope you've all learned something about artillery tonight, and the next time you visit a Civil War battlefield, take the time to examine the artillery there and try to understand the impact it had on the battle. That's it.